All right, we might as well get the oil seals driven home here before we finish up for the day. That way we have everything sealed. Everything should be downhill after that. So what I am gonna do is maybe get a little bit of oil. Down in the crank there. All right, these are pretty easy. I'm gonna put the clutch side in first. You could use a socket, but I think it's really nice to be able to use the OEM seal drivers. And this clutch side is really pretty easy. So in this case, we're not having to slide it over anything. We will be slipping this little metal bushing past it, but that's pretty easy to do. But since we don't have to really slide the inner part of the seal at all you have to do is just your best to try and get it relatively flush, and then this little tool right here will do the job. It'll just fit right over that seal, and we can just tap it home. There, it's going to be flush against the outer race of the bearing. And this bushing will just slide over here, and then what you do is kind of be real careful. You want to screw it, or you want to, as if you're screwing it in with just a little bit of gentle pressure, and what you're doing is you're just sliding it past that rubber until it seats all the way. You know, so just be gentle, turn it as you go. It'll slip past without prolapsing that seal. So now we've got that taken care of. So when we get the clutch on there, there's a plate that'll sit up flush against the end of this bushing. That'll seal it so that no air can get through there. So you won't feel any resistance against this seal after you've installed this correctly, because the bushing is not moving. All right, let's move over to the ignition side, and you can see I'd already slipped that over there to try and keep dirt out. It's a very, very small seal. This particular tool, you're basically going to be driving this down about 3.9 millimeters from the outside edge of this case where these threads are, but it's going to be even. There's a little lip in there. It's going to be even with that lip. And this tool, 1128 890 3900, is designed for this, and probably a couple other saws that use the exact same seal setup. So I'm just going to by hand till I get it up against the case, and then just like we did with the other side, I'll just tap it home, and I'm going to use a smaller hammer for this. So when it bottoms out against the case, there we go. Just about there. Confirm it's nice and flush. That's all there is to it. Pretty simple. We're now going to put some plastic or a appropriate size plastic cup and just cover up that top end till we're ready to put on the cylinder assembly. All right. Cheers, everybody. Bowman out. All right. Before we get the cylinder on, let's put a couple bits on the saw. You can see I put the foil protector on top of the crankcase. Let's go ahead and put the chain tensioner in. Just want to inspect it. Generally speaking, these things don't wear out much, but there's a little nylon plastic, I don't know, guide on the tip here that's going to be facing out. You also want to make sure that you inspect, and if necessary, this was old so I replaced it, but there's a small O-ring in that gear. But it's pretty simple. You just need to line up that guide, press it in, and then it'll go in a little harder here because of the O-ring, so you could just press it with your finger. Pretty simple. And then we'll just get this screw started by hand and at least in place. And then once we get that fully seated, it'll ensure that the tensioner is nice and tight around this O-ring. There we go. Everything is working. If you don't like the tension, you can always put a little, if it's not moving as smoothly as you want it, you can always put a little bit of oil there, but we're in good shape. Tensioner's installed. One of the simpler tasks that you may be involved with when rebuilding a saw like this. All right, let's continue on here. Let's start working on the oiler. Now, I've broken everything down, sent them through parts cleaners. So this is the bare oiler housing. Can't be broken down any further than that. Usually, and I think you can get them, but generally speaking, people will just buy the whole oiler, which comes with all of these parts. So what you've got is the housing here. Here's how it's sitting in the crankcase, and you'll have this, what I call a piston pump, which inserts right in here. The end of this has a slot on it. You can see there, so it's not completely round, and or actually it fits in this side. So when that end is rotating in here where the feeder, this is coming out of the tank and this is coming up and feeding the bar, it creates a suction. And then from the bottom there is a set screw here. It'll have a couple O-rings right there. It'll seat into here. It has a natural stop on it for your adjustment. And then at the end there is a round bit that is not perfectly centered. That will come up against this portion of the oiler, and as it rotates around, it'll move this in or out a little bit and thereby increase or decrease the gap and change how much oil is being fed. When that is inserted into the housing and the set screw is put in here and riding up like that, there's a little pin that you have to drift in here that basically seats this in place, and as a result will prevent anything from coming out. After everything is in place, you kind of put this little plug which will ride up along the side of the crankcase housing here and lock everything in after it's all installed. And then there's one little important piece here, a little O-ring. This is a 4 by 1.5, an S4 by 1.5, and the other O-ring, the other two O-rings are S4 by 2 O-rings that fit right here. So that tries to keep oil from leaking out this way, and this obviously is keeping oil from leaking out in the feeder hole that's going to feed the bar. So at any rate, that's how the oiler works. So what I'm going to do here is just show you there is a washer on the end followed by a spring and then another washer. So you inspect those parts to make sure they're still functional before you reuse them. So this provides the tension when the piston pump is in the housing, like so, because you need to have that tension. You've got a worm gear here that's rotating and interfacing with the teeth on this. You want to make sure these teeth aren't worn, which they're not, so I'm able to reuse it. So as it the clutch builds up enough RPMs and expands, engages the clutch drum, then that will start to turn the worm wheel, which will then turn this piston pump and thereby begin feeding oil. So to rebuild this, what I'm going to do is pop on the washer, the spring, the second washer, and you do want this stuff to be at least well lubricated initially. I mean, over time you'll get bar oil and other stuff that may lubricate it, but it's always a good idea to put a little bit of, I usually use engine oil, and this oil is cold. There we go, from having sit in my garage. So I'm just gonna kiss all of this with a little bit of engine oil. Put a little bit of oil in the housing. Just make sure that we don't have anything dry. We should be more than good enough now. So I'm going to go ahead and feed in the piston pump. Grab my replacement O-rings. When a saw is old, it's really important, just don't even think about it. Replace the O-rings. They get hard, they shrink, and they crack, so then you end up getting the leaks. So these are fairly tight. What I'm going to end up doing is probably using a dental pick here. Let me make sure I still got you guys in focus. Okay. And I'm just going to start feeding the O-ring. Careful that I'm not damaging it here, especially if you're using a dental pick. I'm just helping, coaxing it up over the ridges here. Using my finger there to get that up and over. Now I'm gonna do this one more time. Get the edge over, hold it with my finger. And then a little harder with gloves. I'm trying to stay clean. I've got to coax it over with my nail and hold it. Get it over that ridge. Now I'll do that a second time. I'll be back in just a second. I heard my oven chime. I am in the process of heat treating the piston, so we're doing a little bit of extra work while we're getting that done. So hold on a second. All right, we're back. The piston is in the oven, 400 degrees for 4.5 hours. Okay, so we've got one O-ring in. Time to put the other one in. Exactly same process. And if you're using a dental pick, of course, be careful. They're pretty darn sharp. So again, I'm just lipping it over, trying to grab it with my nail and hold it down while I have it lipped over, and then push the rest of the side around. So it's not a huge deal. If you haven't fit O-rings before, especially that are this tight, it just takes a little bit of practice. But if you go about it methodically, you'll have success. There, we've got both O-rings in place. Okay, so we have our piston pump in place now. We're ready to insert this. Now notice there's a natural stop right there. Here is fully closed. Here's when it's fully open. And I'm just going to keep it in the fully open state. I use a long bar. The employees for this company, which happens to be the state of Minnesota, they're using 20-inch bars, but I generally speaking like to set everything so that it's maximizing lubrication, and then you can adjust it thereafter. Anyway, I've got it ready to go. So what I have to do is a combination of depressing the piston pump and the screw, and if I need to, use the aid of a screwdriver. And we're just going to get this fully seated. Takes a little bit of doing. Those O-rings will want to resist you a little bit. And you do have to have it depressed quite a ways back there. May even need to coax it a little bit to get it in. Of course, you got to be careful you're not bending this tube right here. There, we got it. So it does take a little bit. Now when you got it in place like that, you don't have to hold the plunger anymore, right? But it's now time to get this pin in place. This is what will hold the set screw. You can get it started possibly by hand. And if that doesn't work, you may end up having to use a drift, but you hopefully can get it started by hand first. Might even help to use a pair of pliers. You do have to be careful. If you bend it or mushroom it, then you're going to have a devil of a time getting it in place. Might be able to work from the other end. Now these are spring-loaded clips, right? So because they're a spring-loaded pin, so it could be a challenge getting them started. Anyway, I'm probably boring you, so what I'm going to do is finish preparing this off camera. All you're doing is put another O-ring on this. This plastic plug gets seated in here, and you drift this in place. So I'll be back at you when I get that installed, and then we will get the oiler on the crankcase. All right, back with me here. I'm not sure where we left off. So what I've done here after installing the O-ring at the end, the cap on the end of the piston plug, everything was oily, so I've degreased it using some brake cleaner and a Q-tip and dried it here and then at the base of the oiler tube. The reason why I'm doing that, if I didn't mention it, was that I've got an aftermarket rubber oiler tube, and it is thin where when this housing is fully seated, there's a little bit of a gap at the base here, and I don't want crud getting in there and eventually into the potentially getting into the oil tank. I also don't want any leaks, so what I'm going to do is put a little bit of gasket maker, in this case Motoseal. You could use 1184, or you could also use Loctite 518. Those are solvent resistant, and I'm just going to put it at the base of the cone, maybe up a little bit from the base as well as along the base, so that when I press it in, it's going to push it out and hopefully give me just added extra insurance of decent amount of seal, so that I can keep bar oil from around the clutch side of the saw. So this stuff can tend to really make a mess. You need to be prepared. I'm probably going to use a Q-tip here to do some application. There we go. Nothing more than that. I don't want anything in the oiler hose, so there we go. We've got that ready to go. And you got a little bit of time on that. It won't set up right away. You will have to be careful getting it inserted. All right, so now what I need to do is get a couple of the mounting bolts. For the oiler housing. Now there's a bit of a trick to this, and if this hasn't been already set and pre-fit, you may have a little bit of a job getting that in place. But you start by inserting it. Watch your sealant here. Insert this in at an angle. You're coming from the back, and then eventually you're going to have to press it in fairly hard. That O-ring is going to give you some resistance. So you need to, and it's got, the hose is going to want to twist on you. So anyway, you get it fully seated, and you kind of come at it from an angular position, getting your cone lined up with your hose. This isn't as easy, obviously, as you can tell. It's not as easy as you think. That little O-ring gives a surprising amount of resistance. So you really need to be able to press it in. I'm trying to manage making a mess with the sealant here, but this needs to be pressed in quite a ways to make a good seal. So I'm having to use a fair amount of force there. If you don't get this position correctly, you'll never get it seated. So I still have to come that way quite a bit. And that's because this, there, you see I'm pressing it in more. It wasn't pressed in far enough. Still needs to go forward some. Still got a couple millimeters yet to go to get this pressed in. I do have my cone in place, at least aligned correctly. There we go. I think we're in place. Yeah, everything is seated tight the way it's supposed to. A little bit harder for me to do this while I'm trying to film it. Normally I'd probably have the crankcase horizontal. I'm not going to completely tighten these down initially until I get them, verify that everything is lined up and seated. I can tell that the motor seal that I used does appear to be coming out and seating the way I wanted it to. There's a little excess, and so to keep that from creating too much of a mess, I'm just going to clean up the excess with a Q-tip. There we go. Getting these hand tight. And then off camera, I will go ahead and double check the torque. And make sure that I have it torqued correctly. I'm just checking to make sure that everything's seated the way it's supposed to, and it is. So I will check torque and get it the correct torque on that, and we're then ready for the next phase, which will be installing the worm gear. And might as well get the clutch on. Okay, the final little bit on getting your oil pump set up is to grab the worm gear, check it. You want to make sure that this little, I don't know if you call it clip, but the arm for the oiler is firm, at least seated on this. If this spins, then your oiler won't work because the worm gear will never end up spinning. To get it out, counter or clockwise actually, to get it in clockwise, it'll seat right up against the oiler there, go around the bushing, flush with the bushing, and that's all there is to it. We'll discuss how to properly install the clutch later. I don't want to get the clutch on now until I have the cylinder assembly ready to go. But that'll be our next, one of the next bits that we'll have to do. We might actually get part of the chain brake assembly going here in a minute. But oiler done.